This is Popcorn Theology.
It's the time of year when leaves die and trees turn into skeletons. The garden stops providing, and an evening stroll changes from bright sun and chirping birds to dark night and howling winds. As Halloween approaches, the fact that we begin to consider death and ghost stories is not inherently pagan, it's inherently human. It's what we do with those thoughts that matters. Welcome to a special holiday presentation of Popcorn Theology regarding Halloween. Scary movies come out in droves this time of year. My wife and I traditionally take an evening or two to watch The Crow and other seasonal films, and so the larger issue of Halloween and whether Christians should observe the holiday invariably rises from the grave, shall we say, each October. More to the point, all Christians do observe Halloween from some vantage point, maybe from a distance, maybe with disdain, but we all differ on our level of participation and acceptance of it. Evangelist Jack Chick, for instance, the man famous for Chick tracts, naively depicts Halloween as a night when ancient Celtic druids raped and sacrificed virgins, leaving carved pumpkins on the doorsteps of households that would give up their daughters. Now, never mind the fact that pumpkins were a New World plant exported and only grown in Europe recently. Most of Jack Chick's info is ignorant or made-up myths. But other Christians offer the opposite but equally naive defense of, it's no big deal. They just shrug and send their kids out to eat candy and legitimize American obesity statistics. The reality is, Halloween has a long and complex history, and following a meandering chain linking a pagan harvest festival to toddlers dressed up as Iron Man and Thor is far from simple. Christian and secular historians keep finding layers of revisionist history that try to wrap the origins of this holiday up in a nice little bow, perhaps so it can go into the Christmas tree. Christmas decorations come out early enough. But before addressing the Christians' response to this holiday, let's look at what little we do know. Ancient Celts celebrated a holiday called Samhain, essentially end of summer, where they would extinguish their hearth fires and host large ceremonial bonfires, sacrificing animals and crops. This didn't occur on October 31. But around the same time, depending on the phases of the moon, it marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the season where the people would be dependent on food stores and shelter from the elements. Superstitious Celts associated winter with death and thought that the season's transition was marked by the close proximity of spirits. They believed this thin veil would help their priests make prophecies and enable them to survive the harsh winter. There is an accrued mythology then that Druids also wore masks on this night and went from door to door, but historical evidence doesn't support that theory. It seems more like creative fictions manufactured to explain the evolution of our modern customs. Just remember, if it's on the History Channel, that doesn't really mean it's history. The name of our present-day holiday, Halloween or All Hallows Eve, actually stems from a celebration for saints formed by the early church. That's right, a celebration day for all saints emerges in church history as early as the 4th century, but it was originally set in May or the day following Pentecost. Some records suggest it paved over a similar Roman Day of the Dead. It was the Germans who initially shifted the custom to November 1st, and whether or not this had to do with the practices of the Irish Celts is questioned by historians to this day. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III universally changed the date to mirror the German date in conjunction with the consecration of the chapel in St. Peter's. So All Hallows Day or All Saints' Day would later become a day not only to recognize Catholic saints, but also to commemorate the dead and visit the cemetery to reflect on family or friends who had passed away. Several hundred years later, November 2nd would become All Souls' Day in Catholic tradition, and All Hallows Eve marked the night before, much like Christmas Eve. The focus on cemeteries and the dead had as much to do with Catholic as Celtic traditions, and these accrued traditions and superstitions are a mixed bag stretching up into our own early American immigrant traditions of harvest festivals, and the way Mexican culture turned All Saints and All Souls Days into the Day of the Dead festival. Now, despite myth and folklore imposed in retrospect on this holiday, recent study reveals that trick-or-treating is a fairly new convention that didn't become significant until 1930. In the United States. Europe and other countries co-opted the practice, caught up in our merchandising and global influence. Forms of costumed begging have existed for centuries in Christianized Europe, called mumming or guising, and usually involving singing or performing short plays in exchange for food or drink. Wassailing is another grand tradition of singing and going from house to house. One of the closest similarities we find with a loose connection to trick-or-treating appears in the Middle Ages on All Souls Day, November 2nd, where the poor would go from home to home and offer prayers for those in purgatory in exchange for food. However, strong evidence suggests that childish mischief and vandalism on the 30th and 31st in the early 1900s America, particularly Detroit, where October 30th became known as Devil's Night, these things gave rise to organized evening activity to make actual treats replace the increasing abundance of tricks. So, if Christianity didn't successfully pave over this holiday much as Christmas paved over the Roman Saturnalia, Americana certainly did. This has been punctuated visibly with our indigenous pumpkin replacing the original jack-o'-lantern. Guess what that was? It was an Irish turnip. The seasonal change has been celebrated by pagans and Christians for centuries, taking on the customs of a dozen cultures along the way. Its present incarnation receives disdain not just from Christians, mind you, but also from professing witches and Wiccans. Christians feel it's intrinsically tied to satanic beliefs, and the witches and Wiccans feel it's a distorted mockery of their beliefs. One of the most interesting anecdotes I found in researching the history of Halloween is that one activity many churches do at their harvest festivals is easily the one most linked to paganism. Bobbing for apples, that's actually a divination ritual related to love and fertility. In other words, if Halloween was a social media relationship status, it would say, it's complicated. It's an historical and cultural and religious melting pot, or cauldron, I guess. So, bottom line, to trick or not to treat, that's what we all want to know. Well, if we ascribe church origins to Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, the holiday does still differ from Christmas. But some will make a case that Christmas is also compromised by paganism, just like Halloween. Some will say the same about Easter, that now Easter has roots in pagan fertility rituals, hence the rabbit and, well, Cadbury cream eggs. I love those. Still, as Christmas and Easter have been overrun or co-opted by various trappings that may or may not be pagan, there is still in both of those holidays a clear central focus on either Jesus' incarnation or his death and resurrection. So Halloween, it may not be inherently evil, but it has no inherently specific focus on the Lord we love either. So whether we see Halloween as pagan practices, Catholic traditions, or good old American candy-coated commercialism, none of these offer an overwhelming impetus for Christians to participate. And yet, wearing Spider-Man costumes, or the Wolfman, or a pirate, carving weird faces on vegetables, or engaging in neighborhood activities where you give or receive hospitality, none of those things are unchristian, or things Christians would even traditionally oppose. Fictional fantasy tales of monsters, even scary ones, are not wholly inappropriate or unchristian either, whether they're punctuated on this particular weekend or sprinkled through the year in classic tales from authors including Tolkien and Lewis. So every individual, every household, should obviously examine their response to the modern-day Halloween celebration in our culture. Some will opt to avoid Halloween altogether because a portion of its mixed-up history stab at their conscience. Others see it as a truly Americanized holiday, not specifically Christian, but essentially American, like Thanksgiving or President's Day. They have no conscience issues participating. Others still draw various lines in between. Some don't go out and actively participate, but remain in their homes and hand out candy to trick-or-treaters so they can offer hospitality to their neighbors and community. Others gather together to hold church or community festivals that exclude the more overtly creepy or questionable elements. And we should be careful not to pass judgment on those with different conscience issues on the matter. Colossians 2 says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath." Halloween would seem to fall under this wise caution, much like the issue over meat sacrificed to idols in the New Testament. For those who have shunned Halloween simply because they were told it was evil, or those who have participated but never bothered to question its appropriateness, it may be time on both sides for some employment of godly wisdom and discernment. Our abstinence or participation in regard to Halloween should not be derived from fear, misinformation, or unbiblical pressure, but rather from a sincere love of Jesus. Every response to our culture and its festivals could be a way to point to the God who made us and to whom we should strive to live and serve. As for scary movies, we've covered the horror genre pretty extensively at Popcorn Theology, and you can find out why we don't shun that genre and how it's actually a great area to redeem for Christian conversation. I've also written a whole chapter about it in my book, Cinemaguy. Check out our podcasts on specific movies or our special In the Lobby series on the horror genre as well. Perhaps most importantly, though, for parents, don't forget on Halloween that gluttony is a sin. Be careful not to force your kids to learn this the hard way, lying on an altar of plastic wrap and tinfoil and holding their bulbous stomachs. If you participate in Halloween, it might be the perfect time to instruct your children in the biblical concept of moderation. Oh, before we go, your final fun fact. October 31st is also Reformation Day, commemorating the day in 1517 when Christian reformer Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses challenging the doctrine of penance, the authority of the Pope, and the usefulness of indulgences. Dressing the kids up like reformers might be cool. Handing out doctrinal challenges instead of candy, however, might not be the wisest form of cultural engagement. So until next time, keep engaging media and holidays from a godly perspective. And remember, you are not a mindless consumer.
Thanks for watching this episode of Popcorn Theology. For more content, subscribe on YouTube. Follow and interact on social media to help broaden the conversation. Check out our archive of past episodes at popcorntheology.com or wherever you listen to podcasts, and consider becoming a patron saint by supporting us on Patreon, which lets you interact, influence, and enjoy exclusive bonus content.